Welcome to our video lecture on topic 6.4, gas exchange. Our objectives for today, we're going to distinguish amongst ventilation, gas exchange, and respiration. We're going to talk about the muscle movements that lead to ventilation, and then we're going to talk about the structure of alveoli, how they relate to their function, that function being gas exchange. We're going to outline how different cells, these pneumocytes in the alveoli, help to carry out that function. We're going to describe some of the controls of breathing rate, and then outline disorders of the pulmonary system. Our essential understanding for the day is that the lungs will actively ventilate to ensure that gas exchange can occur passively. We're going to use energy to move air in and out, and then that trading of CO2 and O2 can happen without the need for more energy. Be careful, breathing is not respiration. We've got a couple different processes that are related to each other, but not the same processes, separate but related. Ventilation is movement of air in and out of the lungs. Because we are ventilating the lungs, gas exchange can occur. Gas exchange is that trading of CO2 and oxygen. We do that so that cellular respiration can occur in the mitochondria. We're going to take our glucose, send it into the mitochondria. We've got Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, oxidative phosphorylation. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. So this is why we need the O2. We get the O2 into the blood in gas exchange. We get the oxygen into the lungs in ventilation. Ventilation is the first process that we're going to talk about. Ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. We've got two varieties of that, inspiration and expiration. Air in, air out. This is all controlled by movements of rib muscles and the diaphragm, which is another muscle. So let's talk about these rib muscles first. We've got intercostal muscles, mean between the ribs. So intercostal between the ribs. So here's a rib, here's a rib. We've got these muscles between the ribs. We've got two layers, actually more than two layers. We're just going to talk about two big layers. We've got the external intercostal muscles and then the internal intercostal muscles. Intercostal means between the ribs. We've got some between the rib muscles on the outside of the ribs and then some between the rib muscles on the insides of the ribs. So be careful, external intercostals, internal intercostals, external intercostals, internal intercostals. All of them are intercostal muscles because they're all between the ribs, but we have some that are on the outside and we have some that are on the inside. We also are going to talk about the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a super cool muscle that rests in a dome shape under the lungs. Let's look at how all these muscles move. So these muscle contractions, those intercostal muscles and the diaphragm muscles are going to contract, and that's going to cause some pressure changes in the thorax. Thorax is our fancy word for the chest cavity. And this is going to allow air to move in and out of the lungs, and this is going to ventilate the lungs. So I'm going to talk about them here. The next slide has lots of words. So listen to the words and then we'll read the words. So when we inhale, inspiration, inhalation, we're going to contract the external intercostal muscles. External intercostal muscles are going to contract. That's going to pull the ribs up and away from the lungs. We're also going to contract the diaphragm. We're going to contract the diaphragm and it's going to flatten down, and that's going to make more space, increased volume, and decreased pressure inside the lungs. This is going to lead to the movement of air into the lungs to equalize that pressure. When we exhale, these external intercostal muscles are going to relax, and instead the internal intercostal muscles are going to contract. That's going to pull these ribs in toward the lungs. The diaphragm that had contracted down is going to relax back up into this dome shape, and that's also going to push on the lungs. That's going to increase the pressure, and decrease the volume. Decrease the volume, increase the pressure, and air is going to move out. Good. Let's read the words now. I'm going to be quiet, read the words. Pause the video if you want to pause the video. Read the words. All right, so one more time, I'm going to talk about these muscle movements. When we inhale, inspiration, the external intercostal muscles are going to contract. That's going to pull the ribs up and away from the chest cavity. The diaphragm is also going to contract and flatten down. That's going to make more volume, increased volume, decreased pressure in the lungs, and that's going to allow air to move into the lungs to equalize that pressure. Now, when we exhale, what's going to happen is the opposite. So now our internal intercostal muscles are going to contract. That's going to pull the ribs in on the lungs. That diaphragm is going to relax up and push against the lungs. We now have increased pressure, decreased volume, and the air will flow out of the lungs. Air coming into the lungs is going to be carried through the trachea. So from the mouth and the nose down the trachea is going to branch into these two main bronchi, our left bronchi and our right bronchi. Those bronchi are going to branch into more bronchi and more bronchi until we get little bronchi that are called bronchioles. And then the bronchioles are going to end in these clusters of alveoli that look a little bit like grapes. So here again, bronchiole, and then we're going to end those branches, those bronchioles, with these clusters of grape-like structures, alveoli. Here are a beautiful image of alveoli. So each one of these bubbles, each one of these pockets in here is an alveoli. Each one of these pockets is where gas exchange is going to occur. We have lots of arteries and veins carrying the blood around the alveoli so that we can drop off some CO2 and grab onto some O2. And again, air is moving through these bronchioles and then into the alveoli. We humans, other mammals, have these alveoli, these lungs, but not all animals have lungs and alveoli. So let's talk about what other things have, other ventilation systems. So we need those lungs because we've got big bodies. We need lots and lots of circulation from the lungs around the body. Smaller organisms can actually exchange the gases directly with their environments. So bugs do not breathe air in through their mouths and then take it to a lung system. Instead, they've got these super cool things called spiracles. Spiracles are little holes on the sides of their bodies. Air moves in. Hemolymph is the blood of bugs, and the air that moves in is going to wash over that blood. They're going to trade out that O2 trade out the CO2, pick up some O2, and then that oxygen that diffused in, the CO2 diffuses out, oxygen diffuses in, CO2 diffuses out. Easy peasy. With water-based organisms, they've got that gill system. The blood will flow through the gills. Oxygen in the water will diffuse into the blood in the capillaries of the gills. CO2 in the blood will diffuse into the water that is flowing through that gill system. So lots of concentration gradients going on here. Us land animals, we are going to carry out gas exchange due to ventilation in our lungs and our alveoli. So gas exchange is going to allow air in and air out of the alveoli. There is more oxygen gas in the alveoli, which means that we're going to have a concentration gradient, big oxygen in the alveoli, less oxygen in the blood. And so oxygen is going to diffuse across the wall of the alveoli into the capillary, into the blood cells where there is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that's going to grab onto the oxygen gas and then carry it around to the rest of the body. CO2 is actually a higher concentration in the blood, a lower concentration in the alveoli. And so again, we have a high concentration here, low concentration here. Concentration gradient is going to allow the CO2 to diffuse away from the blood cells through the capillary wall, through the alveoli wall, and into the alveoli, and then we can exhale it. Good. So gas exchange is going to occur across the wall of the alveoli, across the wall of the capillary, and then into the red blood cells where we've got that hemoglobin that is going to grab onto the oxygen. The alveoli are made up of two kinds of lung cells. We've got these pneumocytes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 pneumocytes are here. Type 2 pneumocytes are here. And then, of course, we're going to have some macrophages. Macrophages are some of our immune cells. We breathe in a bunch of junk, and those macrophages are there to gobble up all that junk and deal with it before it makes us sick. The function of the type 1 pneumocytes is gas exchange. Their job is to carry out gas exchange. In order to do that, they are crazy flat and thin, and that allows gas exchange to happen pretty easily. If we had crazy big fat cells here, it would take a lot to get the oxygen through the wall of the alveoli and into the capillaries. Instead, we've got these nice thin walls that allows oxygen to move into the capillaries super easy. CO2 can move out of the capillaries and into the alveoli super easy. These type 1 pneumocytes, crazy flat gas exchange cells, make up the majority of the alveoli. We also have these type 2 pneumocytes. Type 2 pneumocytes, there aren't as many of them, but they do also have a super important job. They're going to secrete this solution called surfactant. Surfactant is a little bit like soap. And it is going to create a moist surface on the inside of the alveoli that reduces the surface tension of the water molecules that are inside the alveoli. We've got lots and lots of humidity in our lungs all the time, and we know that water is polar. And so if I had these water molecules with hydrogen bonds between them pulling the walls of the alveoli in on itself, then it would be really hard for us to have lots of surface area to carry out lots of gas exchange. And so the type 2 pneumocytes, they make this surfactant, and that keeps the alveoli super fluffy so that we can get that oxygen in and then into the capillaries. So how does our body know how fast or slow to breathe? Well, it's all about the carbon dioxide levels in our blood. Carbon dioxide is carried 3 different ways. It can be simply dissolved in the plasma of the blood, so we do have some CO2 bubbles in our blood plasma. Could also combine with water to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. We can also bind the CO2 to hemoglobin on the red blood cells. That CO2 on the hemoglobin is actually transformed into bicarbonate, which is a little bit basic. And this bicarbonate causes the blood's pH to be slightly basic. Remember that 7 is neutral. Anything below 7 is an acid. Above 7 is a base. So these guys are just tiny, tiny little bits above neutral. So they're slightly basic. And it's because of that bicarbonate that is in our red blood cells. In the brain, the medulla or the brain stem, there are chemoreceptors that are super sensitive to the pH of our blood, the medulla oblongata. And if pH gets too low, too acidic, or even if it gets too high, the medulla is going to send some messages to the heart and to the lungs to increase the breathing rate. So we have these signals that get sent to our intercostal muscles, to the diaphragm, to the external intercostal muscles. This is going to tell us breathe faster because we need to move that CO2 out a little bit more quickly. And here we have lungs gone wrong. So lung cancer is a huge problem here in the United States. Healthy lungs are here, definitely sad and angry lungs over here. So lung cancer can be caused by a couple different things. Certainly some of us have a genetic predisposition to lung cancer or any kind of cancer. Carcinogens and air pollution definitely can lead to some lung cancer, as can exposure to hazardous materials like radon. But far and away, the biggest and most easily preventable cause of lung cancer is smoking. Don't do it. It's so bad, my friends. Just don't. Other disorders of the pulmonary system, COPD, which stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and emphysema, which is long-term slow damage to the lung tissues. These can result in shortness of breath and anemia. Anemia because we are not moving oxygen into our blood very efficiently, which means that our ATP are not getting made very efficiently since there's not enough O2 in our mitochondria. The cost of COPD and emphysema here in just the United States is about $32 billion every single year. This is cost of missing work and then also healthcare costs. Emphysema, COPD, lung cancer, the most common cause is cigarette smoking. And this is for older people who are already diagnosed with emphysema. I feel like in another 20 or 30 years, the most common cause will be vaping. And what I'm going to tell you now is don't do that. It's bad. Bad. Don't do that. Just about 2% of the U.S. population is diagnosed with emphysema. It's bad. How do you stop? How do you get better? You don't smoke and you don't vape. There are some drug therapies. We can take these bronchodilators that are going to open up the air passages, make a little bit more space for more air. There's also oxygen therapy. You can increase the concentration of the oxygen in the air that you breathe, and that's going to help you get oxygen into your blood a little bit more efficiently. And then one last gas exchange gone wrong, and we are done for the day, my friends. Asthma is another disorder of the pulmonary system. What happens in an asthma attack? Airways. So now we're talking about the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles. They're going to swell and get narrower. There's going to be more mucus production, which makes it harder for air to get in and out just because these passages are narrowing. There's less space for air to move. It can be caused by lots of different things. It might be a genetic issue. We might have allergens or pollution in the air. You might already have a bacterial infection that's leading to an asthma attack. Physical activity, and then interestingly, stress and big emotions can also trigger asthma attacks. Best treatment is actually prevention. Know what your asthma triggers are and avoid them. Then we also, of course, have inhalers with corticosteroids that are anti-inflammatory meds. They're going to reduce that swelling, open up those air passages, and make it a little bit easier to breathe. We did it! Objectives accomplished under 20 minutes. Look at us. We talked about ventilation. That's air in and out. Gas exchange, that's trading O2 and CO2. And then respiration is what we do in our mitochondria, where oxygen gas is the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. We talked about those muscles that move to lead to that ventilation, the external intercostal muscles, the internal intercostal muscles, the diaphragm. We talked about the structure of the alveoli that allows for gas exchange to occur. We have those two kinds of pneumocytes. Type 1 are super flat, allow for gas exchange. Type 2 make the surfactants of the alveoli do not close in on themselves. We talked about how pH receptors in the brain control how fast we breathe. And then we talked about some of those disorders of the pulmonary system and how we are never, ever going to smoke or vape, because they're terrible. All right, good work today, my friends.